LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2016.
Thank you very much to every one of the presenters. There's a lot of material that I would like to cover during the next hour or so, and there are some questions from the audience. But I'll just succinctly try and summarize a few key points that would stimulate the discussion in about 2 minutes. The topic at hand is, with regards to the Western megapolis, how do we bridge the gap between vision and action through the various elements that were spoken to here by the presenters? Just to go back in history, I'm touching on this in a presentation I'm giving later. The gap between vision and action was addressed in the late 1990s, during the time I happened to have been headhunted by the government to run the Board of Investment as its chairman, was by setting up a centralized unit called the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment within the aegis of the BOI law for the purpose of being a single window to implement PPP projects. Now, PPPs covered a broad breadth of sectors, and I'd like to just touch on the key sectors involving the megapolis, and that is, during the late 1990s, the BII took on middle-income housing development, structured two large projects that have ended up being Millennium City, which some of you are familiar with, in Aturugiriya, and Nivasipura in Ekala. It took on a challenge of quadrupling the number of private hospital beds through a unique structure for land alienation, and managed to encourage the construction of RCT Surgical, Nine Wells, Durden's Hospital, and few other hospitals. Then on IT parks, there were PPP structured to actually create Sri Lanka's first IT park. Not many of you might be knowing this, was the World Trade Center. The Board of Investment in 1996 was the first tenant to move into World Trade Center even before the COC was issued. The Board of Investment funded a fiber optic cable to be run through the entire of the WTC and declared it as an IT park and invited Virtusa, which is today $1 billion company, to locate there. Then during that time, the BII worked with some fantastic master planners. Unfortunately, we didn't have the services of Nana at the time, at the UDA, identified Mala Bay as the IT park, brought in MIT, again on an easy payment term for the land, and the Board of Investment played the role of a venture capitalist and funded SLIT as a startup business with private sector management ethos, but funded by the government. And today SLIT is Sri Lanka's largest IT campus, and it's one of my greatest prize, in fact, in terms of having played a role in co-founding it. So just to get to the question session, so we have some of that same learning that we can apply in implementing the megapolis vision, together with the digitization, together with the HR challenges we are facing. And a very important aspect was identified in terms of why not we market Sri Lanka, because we are competing with the rest of the world. One thing we have that many countries don't have is livability, and I personally feel that we haven't marketed our fresh air, the lack of pollution. I'm sure there are many of you who, you've lived in Hong Kong, and I know the suffering that children go through due to the pollution in Hong Kong. You talked of liberal arts, absolutely important, and this is something in terms of advice, and I'll say this and I'll shut up and go down to the questions. When it comes to real estate, one of the principles, and this is on my website, one of the principles that I've followed in the last 12 or 14 years I've been in real estate, that to do what I call visionary real estate development, it is a combination of left brain, which is your mathematical and your quantitative side, and right brain, which is your aesthetics. Megapolis without aesthetics is no megapolis. It does not build in on the livability issues that I discussed earlier. So left brain plus right brain, and then you minus ego. Ego is when you take on white elephant projects. Private sector is guilty of it, the public sector is guilty of it. And then you have, and that equals what I call inspired real estate. So on that brief introductory remark, I'd like to start the questioning with Harsha. Harsha, we have, in terms of implementing some of the vision that Nayana presented last evening, there is a plan by the government to implement a Megapolis Act. What is the rationale for a Megapolis Act when in fact we have a UDA Act, and how would these two pieces of legislation interface?
Um, Thank you, Thilan. I think the key is that I identified in my presentation also, we need to understand the challenges that we are facing. And if you look at the last 30 years, say from the time the UDA was set up to now, and the challenge that we are facing, and you know it, you have been on the BOI for a long time, we need to cut through a lot of stuff, a lot of challenges. One is, as I said, the multiple layers of governance, multiple agencies that are very powerful. Then the enormous scarcity of land. Then to cut through the government red tape, bureaucracy, which is not necessarily bad, but to sort of update it and get it across. So the question we need to ask is, are we going to look at and sort of evolving our institutions to get there? Because I think our institutions have not developed the way that they should have. Or coming up with something that recognizes these challenges and then acknowledges these challenges and comes up a way that is uniquely Sri Lankan, but in a very pragmatic and a practical way. That, I would say, is the main reason to bring about an institution that is capable of recognizing the vision, the transformational vision, and then being the step to operationalize that vision to the kind of impacts and the outcomes you're looking for.
Thank you. So just to put it crudely, so what you're saying is that institutional capacity, in terms of institutional capacity, we have gone backwards due to primarily, in my view, political interference and appointment of possibly the wrong leadership. And therefore, we need new legislation of the sort of the Megapolis Act, and again, I don't know, Harsha, are you involved in the Special Provisions Development Act? Because I believe it is these two pieces of legislation that's going to be the cornerstone of this government in terms of ensuring execution of investment, both public and private.
I wouldn't use the word backward, but I would certainly say the public sector capacity is something that has been talked of in a lot of ways. But the point I'm making is that we need to transform our institutions also. I don't think our institutions has evolved to the level that we are looking at if you look at the vision for Megapolis. So that evolution has to be recognized, and we cannot afford to wait for another 5 years until the institutions evolve. So that's why I say we need something a little more different that is more suitable to the times.
Thank you. Dinusha, I'd like to come to you. Having seen the evolution of China as an economic powerhouse from the vantage point of Hong Kong, there's been quite a bit of criticism that that development happened at the expense of the environment. How has Hong Kong handled some of these critical environmental issues? Are there any learnings from the Hong Kong-China experience for Sri Lanka?
That's a very good question, and just to take up what you said earlier, it's certainly an important aspect for bringing in new talent and keeping talent, because there are now clear signs of expats choosing Singapore over Hong Kong when they have a choice. So for our human resources challenge, we have to keep that in mind. And Hong Kong did not adequately keep that in mind. It's a little bit tricky for Hong Kong because a lot of the pollution comes in over the border from the mainland. So they don't have that degree of control. I think Sri Lanka is in a much better place to plan being an island and not having those border issues.
Okay, thank you. Ajay, if you don't mind, you've not been a presenter, but I'm sure you can add a lot of valuable insights with your background, having been involved with New York transport and also I believe the underground, is it? Okay, now Nayana mentioned yesterday about the LRT being implemented in Sri Lanka. What is the learning from your experience in New York City, and what is the sort of advice that you might want to give us in Sri Lanka, and particularly Nayana, who's spearheading that initiative, as a means of resolving our transport issues and bottlenecks?
Let me go back to a couple of questions that you guys are going back and forth on, about having a group that's going to implement the whole thing, whether you call it the megapolis or whatever. I'll give you an example from my personal experience. Post 9/11, and we had institutions in the United States who were very mature in every decision making. But 9/11 happened and we had to react. So the government formed a Lower Manhattan Development Authority. And the Development Authority came on top and manage all these institutions, whether it's New York City Transit, MTA, New York City DOT, the Port Authority, private developers, including Goldman, Silverstein, everyone. So the government formed a group basically to fast track all these projects. So I'm hearing two things that, that the institutions have not matured over time. That's one. And second, you've got to do it. The other discussion I was listening to was...
Sorry, that builds on Harsha's point, why we need this sort of new legislation. So that's an excellent point that you made. Yes, please carry on, yes.
Second thing I'm hearing is quality of life. Quality of life is a serious issue now, okay? Everyone who's got kids who are growing up, and Nana talked about it yesterday, about asthma issues and all that. It's not only happening in the developing countries, it's an issue also in the US, where certain cities, the air quality is worse than the others. So people are migrating from those places and going to areas where the air quality and quality of life is good. In order for you to attract the best talent in the world, one thing that people are looking at is quality of life. At the end of the day, all the billions of dollars you've made can't buy you a second of your life. That only the air quality that you grow up, the environment you grow up with, that is going to give you the extra seconds that you have. Coming back to your question about LRT, you've got to start. Mass transit is something that's needed. It's not, we are not debating that issue. And Brian in his presentation had the smart cards, the future, all of that. It's happening. It is happening. So at the end of the day, what's going to happen, and some of it I'll touch in my presentation, is that the old concepts of peak time, off-peak, peak demand, all of that is going to evolve based on technology that's evolving. So we are in a flux. Honestly, there is no good answer for this. But as a team, we've got to come up with the best answer, and an answer that will be flexible enough so we can adapt with changing technologies.
Very good point. Thank you, Ajay. So as far as the megapolis project and the port city project is concerned, the key issue, I think, that will impact on quality of life is traffic and transport. What was put up there in terms of the parks and all that is well and good, but people have to have easy access, and that obviously also has an impact on air quality and things of that sort. So Nayana, are there, I know there are lots of studies done on the transport infrastructure, but aren't there any quick wins that whilst these highways, there are some questions on the highways and things of that sort, I'll get to that in a second, but aren't there some quick wins in terms of road taxes that we can actually start by implementing so that there is quality of life for all of us concerned in terms of addressing traffic-related issues?
Absolutely. Actually, there are. This, I'm sure, will be discussed in the transport panel with Dr. Dimanta and so on. But so while we're doing all this trunk infrastructure, the question is, what do we do for this short term, for this period where we're building out stuff? So there are kind of short-term measures that we are looking at. For example, strengthening enforcement. We find that actually weak enforcement and following of traffic rules is a leading cause of congestion. We're looking at a CCTV camera system around the city and automate enforcement. So we actually get things enforced a little better. We're looking at introducing an office and school bus transport system which is dedicated. So basically school bus transport, which is GPS tracked, which is modern, which actually every segment of the population can actually get involved with. So there's a range of things, and I think maybe I'd like to leave that to the transport experts to discuss in detail that we're looking at in terms of.
Damita, I'd like to get to you. Megapolis, I'm not sure, but certainly over the 25-year lifespan of the port city, there's a requirement of 300 megawatts of power, although incrementally as and when developments happen. Now, from what we learn, there's no Sampur. What is the alternative in terms of the least cost generation plan?
Now there's no Sampur. So we need to come out with the least cost generation plan soon, which Ceylon Electricity Board will come up by April 2017. But as Thilan said, the demand is growing. And we need to capture the new developments such as megapolis and port city into this demand growth. The econometric forecasting may not be valid into the future with these specific projects coming in. So we have to look at ways of providing energy and other services to these projects. What I'm thinking now, as what I elaborated earlier, is that all these projects should not be looked at or planned in isolation. If we are to supply the other services, including the transportation into and out of these facilities, then these projects should be planned as not in isolation, but with all the other required projects. But what I right now see is that this holistic planning process, I'm not sure whether it's in right now. So if we are to get these things implemented, I think first thing we need to do is to have a holistic plan with all the services needed and all the agencies which are related in supplying services and using their infrastructure should be in the project. So for that, I think we need three things to be done. One is we need a conducive legal framework first. Number two, we need a proper or conducive institutional framework where the institutions should be able to implement these projects. And also the third one, as Dinusha mentioned out, one of the most important thing is to have the real human capacity in implementing. So all these things should be together. I think, as Harsha mentioned, the legal framework is now getting in place, the institutional frameworks needs to be done, and the capacity should be enhanced among the people.
What specific areas in the legal framework are missing in your view that is holding back development of the power sector, energy generation sector?
The key is the legislation which protects the investment, and the attraction of investment into these projects are a key. So what we think is that private sector investment is needed if you look into the future. Government cannot implement all these power plants and the transmission lines for the future. So we need to have legislation, the legal framework, to attract the investment as well as to safeguard the investments of the private investors.
Maybe this is a question to Harsha. Harsha, there are more than a dozen independent power plants with private sector investment that was part of the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment in terms of that team of people who were in their 20s and 30s structured the first ever mini hydro, first ever independent power plant, Asia Power, and then went on to do the Mitsubishi barge and things of that sort. So there are these power purchase agreements with the various clauses of force majeure, sovereign immunity, and things of that sort, which have a sufficient legal precedent. So what else is missing?
Well, you look at two things. One is the risk to the investor in terms of risk allocation and coming into that. The second one is a legal framework that encourages investment. I think there's a misalignment there. You see, if an individual comes to me saying, I want to invest in Sri Lanka in the power sector, how do I assess my risk and allocate it? I can advise him as a lawyer. But if you're looking at the whole legal framework that encourages investment, I think we can do a lot. I think that's the point Damit was also making. And the question that you raised, and if you remember the time when PUCSL was set up and the industry regulation of electricity was given to the PUCSL, I think one of the challenges you faced was how do you align all the power purchase agreements, private power purchase agreements that had done with the new structure that we had introduced through a regulatory mechanism. I think the original intention was to break up the power value chain and then bring in competition at every entry point, but for the certain political economic reasons we couldn't do that. But even after the PUCSL came as a regulator, I think there was a nightmare in trying to align the different rates that we had agreed under for different power purchase under agreements, and then bring it to one national policy on tariff as set by the PUCSL. Now this is the kind of thing I think we should be avoiding because we just don't have the time to tell the investors, come now and then waste our time, because it's going to be increase the cost of implementation, increase transactional cost, increase implementation cost. That is something that we can do away with.
I think that comes to Amita's point of having all the stakeholders around the table and having a mechanism so that not just the CEB and you as the regulator, but even invite the private sector, financial structuring specialists in particular, because what I found, what is most lacking in government was the investment structure, in the financial structure, in the investment banking skills, because addressing some of these issues is a combination of looking at legally what's possible, because Sri Lanka is a country of laws and we do not want to unilaterally break binding legal agreements we've done, but there is also an element of negotiation. So just to say one particular issue, when it came to headhunting, who should be the head of the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment? I did not go to a friend or a relation or anything of that sort. I thought, who is out there who has got the best negotiating skills and the best financial skills? And it was that person who was personally headhunted by me, who was brought in. He was a pit bull when it came to negotiation. So is that the sort of thing that would work, Damita, in terms of addressing, I mean, a multi-prong agency involving the private sector as well, including the private developers? Lock yourselves into a room for 1 weekend and you might have the solution. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, actually, Thilan, now if you look at the skill that is required here, is to span the boundaries between, let's say, agencies. There are various agencies with different jurisdictions and objectives. So there should be people who could span the boundaries. And there should be people who could span the boundaries between disciplines. Now there are issues with engineering, economics, finance. Now we have to put all these disciplines together. Now we cannot look at a project or project on engineering aspect or financial aspect alone. So there should be some integrators who could span these disciplines as well as institutions. So these are the integrators that we need. So what I'm asking is, where are these integrators? So we need to get these people quickly in order to implement these projects.
Okay, if I may maybe drop a hint, I believe there are provisions for that in the Development Special Provisions Bill, but I'm not going to talk about it because I don't have the authority or the knowledge to go any further. Right, let me get to digitization. Brian, thank you very much for that informative presentation. Now, lack of social inclusiveness in digitization is a key inhibitant to the grand vision that Mukundan of the ICTA pointed out yesterday. What are the quick wins that we have in terms of, whilst that entire smart card system is being rolled out, what are the quick wins that we can, as a country, embrace to accelerate the process of digitization?
So I think there's a few ways you can start, but there's no lack of inclusion in the government. So the government has the ability to digitise processes, to remove paper, to instrument processes and systems in a much more effective way to both increase transparency and increase efficiency. So if you look at the four digital transformation models I talked about, streamlining operations is a very easy, quick win. And as a result of that, there'll be more accessible online, there'll be more accessibility to cross-agency collaboration because there'll be data sets that can be shared rather than relying on people and paper, which takes a long time, is often locked in warehouses, it's hard to find the data. And so making better decisions and accelerating some of these things will be much, much easier if we can digitise the government as a first step. Because as you rightly point out, not everybody has access to the internet, not everyone has access to a smartphone, and we need to consider not creating a larger digital divide in the community between those that have access and those that don't. There's lots of great work being done already through the Nana Sala projects, through the Loon project trying to bring affordable access into the country. Uptake in technology is generally not our challenge. The challenge is actually getting the data behind those things that's accurate, accessible, and open and transparent. And so I think we could start with the government digitising first.
Would there be resistance? How have you seen in other countries? Because digitization means massive redundancy of the plethora of clerks who actually are document pushers. I mean, are there case studies of countries that have successfully implemented digitization in the context of countries that are in a similar socioeconomic position as Sri Lanka is?
Yeah, so there's a few examples of that, and generally it would start with a sector or a particular area of focus. So maybe healthcare as an example where we could digitise the health sector. In that case, there's a great incentive for all of us to get better clinical outcomes and better access to clinicians. And I'd challenge the idea that digitising processes means the redundancy of clerks, because most of those clerks could be doing higher value work that accelerate service delivery, that improve outcomes for the community. And I think they would like to do that rather than be filling in ruled line books. And so I would challenge that there is definitely an opportunity to streamline operations. And it doesn't necessarily mean reduction in workforce, but greater output.
Okay, thank you. Naina, if I may get to you, could you give an outline of how Megapolis plans to use land as an instrument to encourage affordable housing? I believe there is a million housing program, there is a middle income housing program. It may be touched on another sector, but we're talking of implementation issues here, and Harsha did point out about some issues connected to land alienation, whether it is valuation and things of that sort. But what are the policy measures that you're putting in place to fast track the release of land for these sorts of affordable housing projects?
So what I would say is it's not a question of fast tracking. It's a question of organizing and structuring the release in a way to stimulate the kind of development we want. So what we are doing in that, and the Act will be a big part of this, is first of all consolidating who controls land. Because right now, state assets are distributed among God knows how many institutions. And when you need to mobilize that land for development, it's painful. And if an investor wants to come and pick up something and actually do something, there's a question of who do you talk to, which agency deals with it. And the Bere Lake, which I showed yesterday, is a classic example. We have 226 acres spread across about 10 or 15 agencies.
So if I may interrupt, so some of those lands are owned by Satosa. So what that means is that Satosa will be told, you're not in the business of real estate development. This is a redundant asset. Therefore, what happens then under the law?
Yeah, so what that means is let's have a consolidated window for managing these land assets at a macro level and then allocating them for various kind of purposes, and also a single window for investors and for projects to deal with, saying, look, we need to get this major thing done, and therefore we need to move an asset from one agency to another. That should be a very straightforward macro policy decision, instead of a very painful, arduous process of arguing between agencies saying this is my land and this is yours. So I think that's key. The second, and this is still a bit of a challenge, is how we look at land. Whether we look at land as saying, look, we sell it for the maximum cash value, or we give land to stimulate the kind of development that we want. And this is where how we release land for low income and middle income in particular, housing is important. One of the reasons why Colombo is gentrifying, and we'll talk about this in the housing session, is basically the middle class is priced out of the land market. And there's a disconnect between what we see lands transacting at and what is realistic in terms of rental values and kind of developable value. So everybody gravitates towards building luxury housing. So if we're serious about getting middle income housing into the city, if we're serious about getting more schools and hospitals and stuff into these nodes, we need to really think about how we price land. And it should be a question of, we should not be going for the highest cash value. We should be going for the highest impact in terms of what we want to achieve. And I think that's a shift we're trying to engineer. It's a work in progress, and hopefully we'll be successful.
But is it correct in saying that the new Act, Megapolis Act, would provide the relevant legal authority and avoid public interest litigation, which we've had in the case of projects like Water's Edge, where supposedly land that was acquired for a public purpose, someone went and built a golf course, and therefore Supreme Court, I'm not going to get to that, but it made a directive that must revert back to the state. So does that mean that we can get over some of these legal hurdles. Maybe both Harsha and Nayana can maybe talk to each other, because it's a crucial point. In order to implement the project, you need to have unencumbered land being given to the investor, not to just the right legal structure, but at the right price. Because, for example, if it is for a software park, Virtusa has been looking for a land for years. I don't think you can price it at more than 1 or 2 million a perch, even though the land price might be 8 or 9 million. These are hypothetical figures, so don't quote me. I mean, I tend to be misquoted in the media. So does that mean that the Act will provide that sort of flexibility? Both, maybe Harsha and then maybe Nayana?
Yeah. Okay, I think you picked a very controversial example, Thilan, in Water's Edge. I think the point is about strategic land use planning. Mm-hmm. I think that we should be encouraging is strategic land use planning in the long term. So what we want to avoid is, because land is a big asset. You can just give land and get anybody to come. If I have a land, that's a big asset. But that's not strategic planning. So we are looking at strategic land use planning and looking at our whole land resource, and then building in incentive structures into the legal framework that will prevent the person with authority acquiring land and disposing land outside of the strategic plan. One thing that we want to avoid is, for example, if we do set up the megapolis authority where it faces a crash crunch, it sells a piece of land and gets the cash. That is something we want to avoid. But what we are looking at is a long-term use of land, because land is a public resource, whether it's owned publicly or by the government. In the long term, it's a public resource and it has to be regulated. But one of the biggest things in regulation is having those strategic plans that satisfies those three things: predictability, accountability, participation. Because the more you have it, the less likely it will face the kind of fate that the Water's Edge faced.
Nana?
I fully, obviously, agree with Harsha, but I just want to highlight one thing. I think it's important to note that acquisition is not the only way you can mobilize land assets for development, and that's something we are consciously looking at in the Act to basically encourage citizens to be part of this. So we can look at schemes such as land readjustment, land pooling, and different kind of equity structures about land. So it doesn't necessarily mean that, to do every project, we have to go in with heavy-handed acquisition as the first choice. I think there are situations where acquisition will be required. And I agree with Harsha, it's very important that we put in proper safeguards, that we don't go acquiring willy-nilly and then have to liquidate to just meet some cash flow crunch. That is a risk, and I think we need safeguards in the Act to make sure that this is not done. But acquisition is not the only mode, and we're looking at broader modes, which are done in many other countries.
Kumudu, I know you if you can relate your experience in the US to...
Sure. No, I think what I'd like to add to this conversation is when we are talking about creating new authority and a new legislation, the biggest problem with nation building projects in Sri Lanka is politics. So how do you get the politics out of this? One way to do it is make the authority independent of politics, like the Federal Reserve in the US. I'm not using the central bank in Sri Lanka because that's a whole different story, but that's supposed to be an independent body where the hierarchy and the appointment of the director, etc., is independent of the electoral cycle. It's a 6-year cycle instead of a 4-year cycle. The funding sources are also dedicated, and it's legislated so that they are completely independent of the political system. The second point I'd like to talk about, just from my work in Panama especially, they went through their nation building project, which is the Panama Canal, and then they went through their second phase of the Panama Canal, which is the expansion of the canal to with the third locks project. That was a $5.2 billion project, and when they were doing that, they went to the public for a referendum. In terms of, they pitched to the public, and what that did was it sharpened their communication, their, it was all the risks, everything was out in the public. So that enabled, and the referendum was passed, and now the public buy-in is there. The last point I would like to make is, I think the biggest problem, even with the Western, the megapolis problem, is the communication gap. There is a huge communication gap with what is discussed here with a select group of people and what's communicated to the public in general. And part of that communication gap is because there are multiple agencies talking about different stuff, and if you go to 3 different people, in the government, they will tell 3 different stories about the same project.
You want to comment, Harsha, please?
Just one.
I encourage other panelists also to just give me a signal and jump in.
Sorry if I'm talking too much.
No, that's all right.
But your comment about politics, I think you gave the answer in the last part of your comment. Talking to the people, communicating it, public consultation, that is part of politics. So I don't think we can ever have an institution that's politics free, and I don't think we should even try achieving that. I think what is important is to recognize the incentive structures and bring those incentive structures within a framework that we can manage to get the kind of outcomes we are looking for. Say, for example, the Social Safeguards Division in the Road Development Authority has developed, if you look at during the last 10 years, as one of the best. And now they are offering their services regionally in social safeguards in highway building. Now that's, I think, strategically aligning those incentives and then getting the project outcome, which will not be narrowly defined, but very broadly defined. So to that extent,
absolutely. When I said take the politics out of it, I meant if, say, in the next electoral cycle, a different government comes in, this project still goes on because it has gone through a referendum or a public buy-in, and it continues. And the head of that the institution and the whole team behind that is still the same team that continues the project, not a whole new cast of characters that are replaced with the change in government.
Yes, well, you're talking of the subject of political maturity. I think just to give an example, I've seen advertisements in the Economist magazine where the head of investment authorities of some African countries are globally headhunting their CEOs, paying dollar salaries. Okay, if I'm not trying to pander my own self, but I was headhunted out of 5 people who were interviewed for the position of chairman BO. I was very happy in the private sector running Asia Capital. And I was offered what is an equivalent of today 800,000 a month in salary. At that time it was 100,000, which was 4 times the salary of the head of state. Yes, that puts pressure on me, but nevertheless, I believe that's the way to go in the future. And then a further 8 to 10 people from the investment structuring side, the legal side, and there was excellent collaboration. I think Harsha will be a witness to this between some of the private lawyers who were brought in to do PPP projects with the AG's department, and there was cross-fertilization in terms of skills and learning. I'd like to just, before I get to the questions from the audience, one final area I want to touch is on the environment, which as a bottleneck towards implementing such projects. Now, just to talk for 1 minute about the Port City environment issue, what happened was there was public interest litigation brought against Port City. However, prior to the judgment being, or Supreme Court giving its opinion on that, a new environment impact assessment was done, a very complicated EIA, which is available in the public domain. It was done by the CECB, Sri Lanka's largest state-owned engineering institution. In a period of 6 months, the study was completed. It was put up for public comments. A TEC comprising about 30 or 40 people sat and reviewed it, and it was approved in one sitting. That's how good the EIA was. And then the development permit with some 70 mitigation conditions was issued to the Port City company. Now, and as a consequence of that is the reason why the Supreme Court simply dismissed the issue and said, look here, if you have any issues to deal with, fishermen or whoever, go to the secretary of the ministry in charge, Secretary Megapolis, and you resolve your issues. Now, there is a process in place where EIAs can be done, complicated EIAs can be done, involving multiple agencies within a span of anywhere from 4 to 8 months. Now, I mean, would you be sort of following the policy of the government agency that you represent, doing these EIAs for and on behalf of the investors, or is there a plan on how you can fast-track these environment impact assessment processes?
I think that's sorry, I think that's an important question. I wouldn't say the Megapolis Authority is going to do EIAs, but I do think what we would like to push is similar to what we did with the Port City, really encourage a constructive engagement with investors on how you deal with environmental consequences. So there's 2 approaches to regulation. One is to sit there with a stick, every time you come back, beat you on the head and say, no, go back, come back again. and you keep doing this for about a year until finally, you come with a compliant proposal. The other approach is sit down with the investor, say, look, let's try to get this done. Here's what you need to deal with, and walk them through a process and mobilize the state apparatus to kind of help them through and resolve and work out and optimize proposals. I think that is the approach we would like to take. But that is also going to require a fair bit of mindset change within institutions. And we come back to this question of how do you position institutions to be constructive and to see themselves as being catalysts or agents of change rather than simply policemen.
Go ahead, that's okay. Don't be embarrassed about talking too much because...
I just want to take issue with your use of the word that environment is a bottleneck. Okay. I don't think it's not a bottleneck. I think environment is one of the key criterion that everyone in a project should take into account.
I take it back. I agree with you. Yes.
And I think the challenge for us is, you see, when a project comes to the stage of doing what we call an EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment, that means at a policy level a decision has been taken, this project is going through, and it is going to have environmental consequences. EIA is a process through which you minimize that damage. So if you are looking at megapolis, I think one of the another equally important or more important institution to look at and a framework to look at is the environmental framework. And then we will have to have the decision to make, are we allowing a third party like some private sector environmental firm to do the assessments? Or are we allowing the investor himself to do the EIA? If those two guys do it, will somebody like the regulator look at it? If the government is going to do it, who is going to fund it? Because after the EIA, you might decide not to go ahead with the project, then who is going to pay for that cost? So these are key decisions we need to make. And the legal framework, what it can do is to allow the space, provide the space to make those decisions.
So is there, sorry, Kumar, go ahead.
And also, EIA is done on a project-by-project basis. The communication that I was talking about is, one project may be bad for the environment, but holistically, the megapolis as a whole could be good for the environment. For example, the LRT will reduce auto travel. That won't be captured in an EIA, but that is more a communication thing to the public and the world as a whole, to the investors, that you take the totality of the projects and do an environment assessment.
So would it correct to say, because what you mentioned are procedural delays, as opposed to my questionable word of bottlenecks. Now, isn't there a necessity to strengthen the legislation pertaining to the environmental impact process, looking at megapolis, looking at port city, of trying to minimize these procedural delays by introducing some new regulations?
I think absolutely, you're absolutely right. But there are two types of delays. One are delays that are essential, part of the process. You can't do away with those. Agreed. You need to take the time. And then there are delays. There are delays that you can do it. A little bit of process re-engineering, you can deal with those. So where we can do the process re-engineering, we need to do it. And we need to do it fast. And we need to have somebody with the authority to say, look, we need to get this done this way. And if somebody is refusing, we should be able to take it over from that person and do it anyway. But where decisions have to be taken, deliberated, and the adequate time is spent, I don't think we should compromise, because if we do, the consequences will be felt, not in 5 years' time, but 10 years' time.
And it all boils down to the terms of reference. Okay, let me get to the questions by the audience. Okay, there is a question about access roads to Port City. According to the plan shared yesterday, are they adequate? Maybe I can give a quick answer saying probably not, without overall transport policy measures to address various aspects. It requires a multiple approach. Am I correct in saying?
Yeah, I think no amount of highways is going to solve our transport problem, basically. I think unless we really take this public transport business seriously and engineer this transition, no amount of widening roads, and no amount of highway building, and no amount of flyover building is going to solve our transportation crisis. It will help temporarily, until we buy more cars because it's easier to get in. So I think this mass transit pill is something we have to swallow. It has to be done.
The next question is connected to HR. Questions on the form of, do you propose to get overseas Sri Lankans to assist in the various initiatives? I would say the answer is yes. Certainly there are many qualified overseas Sri Lankans. And I believe that in the Prime Minister's office there's an HR unit being set up to tap into these resources. And then a question about attracting foreign talent, but isn't it costly? Can't we sustain local talent who are going abroad as a solution? Now, it's a difficult question to answer, but let me answer it this way, and maybe I'll ask Dinusha to address it. When the private sector decides on hiring local talent or private or international talent, that's the management decision that is taken by that company. And obviously, overseas talent is more important, more expensive. Housing might have to be provided, etc. So fundamentally, we as Sri Lankans, I had to do it in my 20s after graduating from universities and whatever. We have to compete with whether it is local talent or foreign talent, and if we are to progress as human beings. But are there any other? I mean, you did mention certain other initiatives that we need to implement to attract the talent that is out there. You want to elaborate on that, Dinusha?
I think the question is, as you said, a very tricky one. And I agree with you that it ultimately should be employer-led. The systems that seem to be more successful, and The Economist had a report about this quite recently, that sort of employer-led immigration systems tend to result in sort of lower unemployment and better outcomes than the sort of points-based immigration systems and more government-run immigration systems. Can we use local talent better? It goes back, I think, to the education systems. Why do people want to hire foreign talent is the question that we should be asking. And can we make local talent more competitive? And that's a longer-term project. I've been on both sides of the coin in this particular question, is sort of being, for example, in Australia, and sort of seeing similar questions about immigrants in the newspapers. Well, why do we need them? Can't we just have local talent? And my reaction as an immigrant was then, you should be lucky to have us. And I think people who come here would feel similarly that their contribution.
Brian, I want to pose this to you. I mean, isn't the internet today a tool? I mean, this is where digitization comes in, for you, each one of you, to be more competitive. I mean, my 13-year-old son learned software programming online, and at 14, he was a rupee millionaire. I mean, he doesn't support me as yet, but very soon he will. He's 18 years old. But today we have the tools to become competitive, whether it's a Khan Academy or you can just about learn anything online.
Yeah, so there's two things I'd say. First is to kind of reinforce what you were saying around talent. Employer-led talent programs are inherently more successful, but any successful ecosystem in nature or in business has diversity. And so it should be less about, am I using foreign talent or local talent, and more about, do I have a diverse workforce? Gender, ethnic background, language, country of origin are all forms of diversity. And so diverse organisations are more successful at relating to their customers, they're more successful at innovation. And if you look at countries like Singapore and Dubai, where they have a very high international expat community, they are economically very strong in the last 30 to 50 years as a result of their liberal migration policies. So it's a very sensitive subject. Every country grapples with this. But to get back to your question, there is definitely, we're in a global society, and there is fortunes being made all over the world from remote locations. So my wife can't work in Sri Lanka. She's on a spouse visa. She's unable to work. She's not allowed to even volunteer on her spouse visa. And so she writes, and she works in Australia from Sri Lanka, and she makes a good living doing that. Now she has to pay tax in Australia and all of that sort of stuff, but we live in a global economy, and most of us can do our work from anywhere. And the fact that we have such a strong BPO community in Sri Lanka, such a strong BPO industry, is a testament to that.
Naina briefly, and then Kumudo very briefly. Yeah.
I just want to come in on the point of harnessing local talent versus foreign talent. I think we basically need to do both. One of the things I think, given that we need to get so much done pretty fast, we will have no choice but to actually look for foreign talent, for highly skilled kinds of roles that we will need to fill in the immediate future. But to your point, I think there's no. That's not something that will replace the need to really upgrade our education system. I think we have to get into the mode of producing higher quality professionals and graduates in the country. We need to get world-class institutions to set up here instead of having them all ship out to the US and never come back, for example. So I think there's a short term that we have this skills gap that we need to fill, but there's also this kind of longer term we need to build up our own education system so we can produce the kinds of skill sets that can fill the jobs we need to.
Yeah, I think this is a key point, and I think we are inherently scared of foreign talent, and that's a really, really bad thing for the country, because we absolutely need foreign talent, both Sri Lankan foreign talent who's working overseas, coming back to Sri Lanka, as well as foreign talent coming. And for example, the US, I mean, their whole policy of innovation is led by foreigners, Indians, Chinese, some Sri Lankans.
Okay, so there is a question connected to the ETCA and the movement of talent, but certainly ETCA does not mean the country gives up its right to control immigration. As Kumudu mentioned, the country requires entrepreneurial talent, technical talent, engineering talent, management talent. We have a shortage of nurses, we have a shortage of construction workers, etc., etc. So there will certainly be a policy in place that wherever there are shortages and skill, whilst there needs to be certainly skills development. So I'll move on to some other questions very quickly because we have about...
Can I just say one little thing that from the Hong Kong experience on that point is trying to align the interests of local workers with the influx of overseas talent. So, for example, in Hong Kong, overseas law firms are allowed to practice. They practice sort of on basically an equal basis to local law firms. You would think that the local lawyers would not like this and resent it, but actually, right now, I think they would be the last people to want international law firms to leave, because they've seen now that international law firms provide good training for local lawyers.
Absolutely.
They give them better opportunities to travel, internships, networks. So trying to kind of sell to the local talent pool that actually this is good for you.
I fully agree, and please, this I can go on record, by the way. We need to open up our accounting profession. We need to open up our architectural profession. We need to open up our legal profession for foreign established firms to come and locate in this country. It will uplift the entire industry. So that I don't mind being quoted. Okay, there is a question, isn't there a dire need for the re-establishment of the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment to spearhead government structuring and implementation of large-scale projects? We now have a plethora of multiple agencies talking loosely about PPPs without understanding the process itself. I believe there is a World Bank study that has been done, and there is a recommendation that the PPP unit should be centralized in one particular location. I will not talk further about it because that's the prerogative of the government. Answer is yes. Sri Lanka.
I'm sorry.
Oh, we are out of time.
Okay, we have to wind up now. 10:45.
My watch is slow. Okay, fine. Carry on.
Yeah, but you would like to say something? Complete it. Yeah.
Well, just to wrap up, I think apart from the legal issues that we spoke about, the key implementing agencies of private investment in the country, BOI, UDA, Megapolis, Tourist Board, certainly these institutions have to be strengthened. We are a country of laws, and we must be a country of environment. Certainly, absolutely no way around it. We cannot have dictatorial types of projects being implemented because I want an airport in Mattala, which I believe is the mother of all white elephants. We must implement it. We must follow due process, whether it is whether it is a matter of environment or whether it is in terms of the legal framework. One final comment I'd like to make in the 1 minute I have available is the importance of communication. It was touched on by the panel, and mindset change. There are very simple ways of having the buy-in of the general public. And that is providing a very credible message of why policy reform is being done. And this is something that I keep on saying over and over again. Let's not pussyfoot around the word of privatization. Let's address it head on. When Sri Lanka Telecom was being privatized, I happened to be chairman of a task force at the time. The very simple message was do you want to wait 2.5 years on average for a telephone line? That's how long you had to wait in 1997. When the part of the port was being privatized, the message that was sent was, do you ever want the port to go on strike and bottleneck all the imports and the exports that are going out of the country? So competition was created. So you communicate, you engage the masses, have their buy-in, and if we can address that communication gap, I believe a lot of the work, Harsha, Nayana, and all you gentlemen who are assisting, who want to assist this country, would have a far easier job. Let's get the communication right.
LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2016.